Welcome, everyone. This is the next workshop in the 2023-2024 Seal of Biliteracy Professional Learning Webinar Series. My name is Candace Black, and I am your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Training Panelists to Evaluate Culminating Projects and Presentations. In this next webinar, panelists must be trained in how to use the rubric to identify and discuss the acceptable evidence to justify the proficiency level attained by the student. This webinar will discuss the process for recruiting and training panelists to evaluate culminating project and presentations for the New York State Seal of Biliteracy, including working with school staff or community members who may not have a background in student work, presentations, and recordings of panelist discussions following the presentations to identify high leverage practices, as well as practices to avoid when calibrating scoring. Our office's annual process of visiting SEAL schools to provide feedback and support will also be reviewed. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Gonzalez, who will give us a brief introduction on himself. He is my co-presenter today. And without further ado, Jordan, I'd like to invite you to open up the webinar.
Thank you so much, Candace, and good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Jordan Gonzalez, and I'm an administrative coordinator and lead resource specialist for the Long Island Regional Bilingual Education Resource Network, also known as the RBIRN. Our mission involves offering regulatory guidance and professional development for English language learners and multilingual learners. Additionally, I serve as a faculty member at St. John's University in the graduate programs for TESOL and bilingual education, while also taking a leadership role on the board of directors for the New York State Association for Bilingual Education, also known as NYSSB. My dedication to the Seal of Biliteracy initiative traces back to 2017. With the support of Candace Black, I initiated the Seal of Biliteracy program in Yonkers Public Schools, where it continues to flourish today. And I would like to turn it over back to Candy.
Oh, and thank you. And Jordan, that's okay. You don't need to. I'm good.
Okay.
I introduced myself. Just keep going.
Absolutely. So for today, as Candace had mentioned, the electronic handouts can be accessed by using this QR code, which you can access using a mobile device and the camera function to gain access to our electronic folder, which has all of the resources that we will be sharing today. You can also access this folder by using the short URL link below. Also, all of the materials shown in this presentation will also be accessed on the NYSSB website, which you can also access by using the QR code here, as well as the link below. To facilitate the submission of questions for today's session, please enter them in the following Google document. You can find this in the link where it's entitled Question Catcher, which I'll put into the link into the chat right now. Questions will be answered in the order they are received, and if time permits, participants will be able to unmute themselves to ask a question or may enter them into the chat. So here are today's session goals. First one, I can explain who can serve as a panelist. I can identify some strategies for recruiting panelists in various languages. I can identify the important steps in training panelists to evaluate student performance, such as I can find the culminating project rubrics on the New York State Seal of Biliteracy website, including Category 1 and 2 languages, Category 3 and 4 languages, and classical languages. I can explain the 3 modes of communication. I can describe how the presentations are conducted and the expectations for student performance. I can identify the expectations for the panel interview following the student presentation. I can identify the facts, functions, accuracy, context, and text types of the performance indicators in the culminating project rubrics. I can describe best strategies in discussing acceptable evidence for the Seal of Biliteracy culminating project and presentations. I can identify resources to train panelists and calibrate their scoring. And then lastly, I can identify and find additional resources provided by NYSSB for the Culminating Project, as well as the Arbor resource specialists that can assist me with the Seal of Biliteracy. Just note that for the purpose of this webinar, we will be discussing the training of panelists for the Culminating Project and presentation in world languages. However, the information presented here applies to projects in English as well. The following information can and should be included in the training of those serving on the panel. Schools are encouraged to use the following slides and resources to train their panelists. So the first and most important question, who can serve on the panel of reviewers to evaluate student projects and presentations? To serve on the panel of interviewers to evaluate the student projects and presentations, a panelist must be a fluent speaker of the language of the presentation. Each panel must consist of at least 2 adult speakers of the language who are not related to the student. How can I go about recruiting panelists? 1, you can identify the languages of the student presentations beforehand to see the languages that are represented with the upcoming presentations. Second step is for your world language faculty are a natural choice for panelists. Then survey your school district, faculty, staff annually to find out if anyone speaks a language other than English. Reach out to local colleges and universities to identify professors that speak languages other than English that might serve as panelists, which is a great opportunity to foster connections and relationships with our higher education partners. And also reach out to your local BOCES in Arbor to identify speakers of languages other than English, for instance, that might have served as interpreters for parent meetings that can also serve in this capacity. How can I go about recruiting the panelists? In addition to those just mentioned, you can also reach out to community-based organizations, CBOs, that might have speakers of other languages, Italian American Community Center, Ukrainian Federal Credit Union. For less commonly taught languages, reach out to the family of the student to ask if they know of someone who is not related to the student who speaks the language of the presentation and can serve as a panelist. Remember that when necessary, as in the instance of a very uncommon language, the panelists can connect to the presentation via video conference using various types of telecommunication programs. And when all else fails, look into translation services such as Lexiki, Proprio, NTC, and Precise Translations that can provide you with a consultant who's fluent in that language to help support and serve as a panelist member. So what is important to consider when recruiting a panelist who is not an educator? When working with school staff or other community members who don't have a background in education, consider the following. Use layman terms when training the panelists on the rubric and describing the process, and simplify the rubric when necessary. In addition, I would add, provide opportunities for them to ask questions and to clarify any of the terminology or language that is present within the process. Now let's shift to how is student performance evaluated? Here's an example of a student performance on the Culminating Project is being evaluated using a rubric, as suggested here with the OBEWL rubric. So there has to be a Culminating Project evaluated using a rubric. And what rubrics are available for these types of projects? The project and presentation are evaluated using a NYSSB-approved rubric that is aligned to the New York State learning standards for world languages. Schools may use the OBEWL suggested rubrics for modern 1 and 2 and modern 3 and 4 languages, as well as the classical languages. We have 3 separate rubrics for those. You can use a consortium's rubric, or the school or the district may develop their own rubric. However, if you're going to develop your own rubric, it's important to note that schools choosing to elect or create their own rubric must submit said rubric to NYSSB for approval annually, along with their New York State Seal of Biliteracy school notification form. So let's take a look at the data in terms of the choices that the participants engage in terms of the rubric options. It's nice to have options, and let's see what are the ones that are being currently used in the field. So this is from 2023 to the 2024 school year, and the rubrics that are being used. As you can see, the vast majority of schools and school districts are using the OBEWL rubric, about 63%, followed by those within New York City that are using the New York City Biliteracy capstone rubric. Third is those using the consortium rubrics, about 8%. And then lastly, about 4% are using their in-house rubric to evaluate the student culminating projects and presentations. So what are the three categories of languages? As referenced prior, language are categorized by NYSSB into three categories based on their difficulty to learn as an instructed language. Categories 1 and 2 are languages that are closer to English that use a Roman-based alphabet, such as Afrikaans, Danish, Dutch, French, German, Haitian Creole, Indonesian, Italian, etc. Category 3 and 4 languages are those that are further away from English and or do not use a Roman-based alphabet. These are all other modern languages such as Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, Japanese, Korean, just to name a few. And then for our classical languages, these are languages from an earlier time in human history that have no living native speakers, such as Latin, ancient Greek, and ancient Hebrew. As mentioned, there are rubrics for each one of these categories of language and are easily accessible through the state website that can be utilized as part of your Seal of Biliteracy process for the culminating project and presentation. So what are the major elements of the culminating project? The first portion is the written portion, what students write in preparation for the culminating project, which occurs typically prior to the panel presentations. The next is the oral or signed presentation of their culminating project. And then the last step is either the oral interview or the signed interview, where the panelists engage in questioning and answers with the students regarding their presentation. So here are the steps. How is the culminating project presentation conducted? So the student presents their project. This is a monologue delivered in the target language by the student. Panelists should only intervene if the student absolutely needs it. This is a one-way mode of communication. The next step after the student concludes their presentation is that the panelist interviews the student. This is a spontaneous conversation in the target language between the student and the panelist following the presentation to allow for the student to speak more extemporaneously. And then the last step, once the panelist interviews are over, the student leaves and the panelists amongst themselves discuss the student's performance. The panelists will share and discuss evidence of the student's performance using the language of the rubric that was gathered during the presentation and interview, using very specific evidence to suggest the level of proficiency within the rubric that's needed in order to be endorsed for the Seal of Biliteracy. Just note that there are 3 modes of communication, and students are to be evaluated across all 3. They are to include the interpretive mode of communication, how well students can understand, interpret, and analyze using authentic written, spoken, or signed text. Now, during the presentation itself, students won't be reading to demonstrate their interpretive mode of communication. However, you should be able to indirectly gauge with their references to written text or to other audiovisual text as part of their presentation, as they may reference these sources to substantiate their claims. The interpersonal mode of communication is also evaluated. How well students can exchange information and ideas in conversations. And this takes place during the questioning portion as panelists engage in questions with the presenter. And the last mode to be evaluated is the presentational mode. How well students can present information, which is completed during the presentation of the culminating project. So how should the panel discussion of student performance be conducted? Each student should be evaluated immediately following their presentation and interview, after the student has left the room. Panelists review their notes and then present evidence using the language of the rubric gathered during the presentation or interview to come to a consensus on the proficiency level assigned. Multiple questions that are open-ended, information gathering, and tied to the presentation should be posed by each panelist to ensure that ample and varied evidence is gathered for the proficiency level attained. In other words, a minimum of 2 panelists are needed to serve for the questioning, and each panelist needs to ask multiple questions. 1 question per panelist would not suffice. So now we're going to shift into what are the modes of communication. Candy, remind me, is this your portion or shall I continue?
Please continue. Yes, I'll let you
Absolutely.
know.
Thank you. So the 3 modes of communication. So we have the interpretive mode of communication, which includes listening, viewing, receiving, and reading. The interpersonal communication is speaking and listening, whereas the presentational communication is speaking and writing. However, with presentational communication, it's one way, where the student is presenting or the student is writing an essay. Whereas the interpersonal communication is where there is an exchange of meaning and communication between the student and another speaker. So the interpretive communication, which has all of the modalities, are evaluated by the classroom teacher or advisor prior to the student presentation. So the written portion of their culminating project typically is reviewed and evaluated prior to their presentation. Whereas when it comes to the interpersonal communication and presentational communication, these are evaluated by the panelists at the time of the student presentation. Most students score at least the required level in each mode to earn the 2 points for the culminating project. Yes, students must demonstrate at least the required level of proficiency in all 3 modes, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, in order to receive the 2 points for their culminating project and fulfillment of the world language criteria. What are the general guidelines for the culminating project and panel presentation rubric? Students may be evaluated holistically on the 3 communication standards: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. This rubric is used to evaluate both the project itself, the scholarly essay or portfolio, which has a collection of the students' work, as well as the oral signed presentation of the project to the panel. The interpretive mode is generally evaluated prior to the presentation by the classroom teacher or project advisor. Typically, the essay, the scholarly essay or research, or the portfolio, again, is evaluated prior. The interpersonal and presentational modes are evaluated at the time of the presentation of the project. Now, why is the interpretive mode evaluated prior to the presentation? Interpretive listening, receiving, and reading are not observable during the presentation, and instead must be evaluated by those adults who have the opportunity to observe the development over time of these skills by the student. Students should be assessed by a panel of reviewers consisting of 2 or more adults who are qualified speakers of the language being assessed. The student's current teacher should not be the sole reviewer of the project and presentation. While schools are encouraged to recruit community members to serve on the panel of reviewers, evaluators should not be related to the student. If the presentation is given in a low incidence language, or if there is only one adult speaker of the language in a district, the panel may consist of fewer reviewers. Every effort should be made by the school to secure 2 adult speakers of the language. The entire presentation and panel interview must take place in the language being assessed. Students, especially our English language learners and heritage language speakers, may represent all parts of the world and therefore may exhibit significant linguistic diversity relative to what may be considered the standard version of any language. Panel members should avoid lowering the assessment due to a student's accent, pronunciation, or culturally specific vocabulary, so long as these aspects don't hinder the comprehension of the panelist members. So what does the Culminating Project assess? What is assessed is proficiency. And here we define proficiency in the target language in 3 modes of communication: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, as measured by the Culminating Project rubric. And we use it using the acronym FACT. F, what language function, such as identifying, describing, explaining, can the student perform? A, how comprehensible is the student and how accurate? Use of time frames, etc., is the language. C, in what contexts, such as topics, can the student communicate? And T, what is the length of text, sentences, connected sentences, paragraphs that students can handle? And what is not assessed? Things such as accents, pronunciation, culturally specific vocabulary, poise, confidence, eye contact, and dress, just as long as it doesn't impede comprehension. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Candy.
Thank you, Jordan. So I hope that you've been following along, because what we are doing is we are modeling for you what we hope you will do when you train your different people. Wonderful. Okay, so let me start the slideshow from that slide. So we are going to build on what Jordan talked about in terms of FACT. And let's start by taking a look at one line of the rubric, and we're going to notice the different parts, and then we're going to dissect those performance indicators. So here on the leftmost of the rubric, on all 3 of them, you have the standard that's listed, and underneath a guiding question. Then you'll see across the top in green and orange, the proficiency sublevels that range from intermediate low to advanced high. With underneath each sublevel, you'll see that we have can-do statements. Now, these can-do statements are very broad and they're skill-based, so they do not refer to a specific task, but rather to a skill. Taken together, we call these can-do statements performance indicators. Notice that in order to help out our panelists, we have also highlighted the target proficiency sublevel we're looking at. Now, in this case, it's a category 1-2 language, so our target is intermediate high. So what we're going to do for you now is an activity that we encourage you to do with your panelists, and that is to take each standard, and we have highlighted only 3 sublevels just for ease of presentation, and we're going to dissect each performance indicator into the facts that Jordan went over, right? The function, the accuracy, the context, and the text type. So we'll guide you through this one, and then by the time we hit standard 3, I'm hoping that you're going to be able to mouth along with us what you know to be the correct answer. So as we start on this, let's identify these again. Your function is your purpose for communication. What are you doing with the language? At our intermediate mid-level for interpretive, we're talking about understanding the main idea and key information. But as we move through intermediate high, we're looking at now following that main idea, the main message, and the flow of events. And by the time we've hit advanced low, we're looking at also being able to identify underlying messages as well as supporting details. Now, accuracy in general, in the national performance indicators, which our New York State ones are modeled after, it doesn't really appear grammatically until you get to intermediate high. In the terms of accuracy, we want to make sure that our definition is not solely this idea of grammatical control, because the reality is that accuracy, especially at the lower levels, represents comprehensibility rather than control. Our accuracy, remember, here's where you see that various time frame comes in, and we're going to see that again when we get to the other levels as well. Our context, remember, is the topics that students can talk about, and they generally go from very, very familiar to things that could be abstract and researched. So you're going to see that we can talk about things like straightforward, etc. Our text type refers again to the length of text. That's how much text a student can understand. And generally, we're talking at the very lowest levels about the word and phrase level. You'll have isolated sentences, strings of sentences. By the time they get to that target intermediate high, we're talking about paragraph length texts, right? So let's try this now with interpersonal. It should be a little bit more straightforward. Our function. See if I'll pause briefly, see if you can identify what words at each sublevel are going to appear in the color highlighted for function. Hopefully, you're getting things like exchanging information, preferences, feelings, or opinions. Notice that when we get to advanced low, we're progressing to interacting and negotiating with meaning. Remember, our accuracy doesn't really rear its head until intermediate high. See if you can identify the words within intermediate high and advanced low that are going to refer to accuracy. Okay, hopefully you're getting that across various time frames and across major time frames. We often get the clarification question, well, what's the difference? Well, various means at least more than one, right? Doesn't specify the particular time frames, but students can exchange information across more than one time frame. Versus advanced low gives more specificity and talks about the major time frames, which we would define as past, present, and future. Now let's talk about context. See if you can identify in the different sublevels the context, that is the topics that a student can handle. Intermediate mid, we're looking at familiar and some research topics. Intermediate high, familiar, concrete, and researched. And then we move to advanced low and we get concrete, academic, and social topics. Okay, our last one, our T, text type. What length of text can students handle? See if you can identify the words that will be highlighted in purple. If you said sentences and series of sentences, for intermediate mid, you are correct. Intermediate high, we're moving to sentences that may form paragraphs. And advanced low, simple paragraphs. Now, by the time you get to that third standard, we're going to go through this very quickly. If you're training panelists, this should be coming a lot quicker because you're going to see a lot of patterns that are forming. Our function for presentational communication, narration, and delivering presentation and stating viewpoints. Our accuracy, again, doesn't rear its head until intermediate high when it's across various time frames, and advanced low when it is across major time frames. We see a similar pattern with our context. Familiar, concrete, and research topics. Same for intermediate high, although we're looking at more of a variety. And then concrete, academic, social, and professional topics of interest. Similar pattern as well for our text type. Intermediate mid's going to be using sentences and series of connected sentences. High will be using short paragraphs. And advanced low will be using paragraphs. So again, hopefully this is an activity that you can do with your panelists. So we have a couple tips that we want to share with you based on our experience doing this with a number of schools. During your student presentations, your panelists should be taking notes on the evidence so that they can have a discussion with the panel after the student has left the room, and they can cite this evidence to come to consensus on what the student's proficiency level is. They're also taking notes on the interview performance of the student. Now, we want to make sure that the evidence you're collecting is what we're calling low inference. This means that it is concrete, specific, and observable data that speaks directly to the student's language proficiency and skills. We're not using ambiguous language like the student did a good job. Well, what does that really mean? Following the presentation, and that includes following the interview, we're going to have the student exit the room, and then the panel is going to discuss the evidence that they've gathered and hopefully come to a consensus on what the proficiency level achieved is. Remember that the discussion should specifically reference the language of the rubric. So you're going to be wanting to take those F, A, C, and T's and talk directly to that. So if you observe that the student was able to present at the paragraph level, that's going to be much more powerful than saying, oh, the student did a good job on their presentation. So let's talk about some high leverage practices for panel discussions. Number one, make sure that all of your panelists are familiar with the rubric as well as the target that the student is shooting for. In most cases, this is going to be intermediate high. For our category 3-4 languages, it's going to be intermediate mid. And then, of course, for Latin, it's going to be intermediate high, but for interpretive reading. In addition, panelists should make sure they're engaging in consensus building of the student's performance. So this is a discussion, all the panelists are equal, and they should be engaging in this thoughtful discussion to be able to reach an agreement. While they're discussing, it's again important that they're citing evidence from their observation of what the student did, and you're calibrating those observations with the language of the rubric to justify your rating. When you discuss this, you're not looking for an isolated performance. For instance, that students at one point in their presentation use connected sentences, but the rest of the time they use disconnected sentences. Instead, you're using an approach of a preponderance of evidence. What patterns did you see in student performance that lead you to believe that you have a justifiable rating? You also want to make sure that you're using impartial, non-judgmental, and descriptive language about the student's performance. Talking about the student's accurate use of time frames is very different, again, than saying the student did a good job. Now, there are some practices that we'd also like panelists to avoid. We want to avoid making assumptions about a student's performance based on a variety of factors, including, did the student dress up for the day? While we do want to teach students that dress has an impact, we are only evaluating the student's proficiency for the Seal of Biliteracy. We also want to make sure that all panelists share their evidence and judgment of the student and that they contribute to the overall discussion. We don't want there to be any one panelist who is dominating the discussion and where other panelists don't feel free to be able to share what they have thought. So we want to avoid things like simply saying agreed. Instead, to say, I agree with your statement, and here's why. Here's what I observed that coincides with what you're saying. We also want to make sure, if you happen to be the student's classroom teacher, that you're not allowing the student's previous performances in your class to be a basis for the evaluation. Now, we all know that students get nervous as a part of these presentations, and we are going to cut students some slack for that. It's a skill that we try to teach them. But we're not going to forgive a poor linguistic performance simply because the student was nervous and they have a history of doing much better when in their classroom. Instead, we're going to provide the student with some guidance and another opportunity to show what they know. So I want to highlight my friend and colleague, Maria Fenton. If you haven't had the opportunity to meet or to hear from her, she is a resource specialist at the Mid-State Arbor at OCM BOCES. And she has recognized that within her very large region, which spans from the Pennsylvania border all the way up to the Canadian border, that her particular region needed something to help the individual schools within that region through the culminating project process, because training panelists can take up a lot of time. And so what Maria did was, instead of having each individual SEAL school conduct their own culminating project presentations, she organized within each of her 9 BOCES in the region a World Language Day. And there is a separate presentation that we're going to link to the minutes that you can actually watch Maria talk for about 45 minutes about this day. But in short, what this is a day where you can bring your students, and the BOCES gets all of the panelists for you. They set up a schedule. Your students give their presentation, and the panelists don't know the students. They are from another school that's participating. So we have a extra valid, completely impartial estimation of the student's proficiency. If you participate in this, generally you would be brought in as a world language teacher to then evaluate students from another school. So one of the benefits, again, is that having a regional world language day, the BOCES takes care of recruiting panelists. Now, this is a big deal in a lot of our districts, especially if you have English language learners that teach a language that you do not teach at school. It can be a very daunting task to have to secure these panelists. The World Language Day also takes on responsibility for training panelists. So they have a calibration session where they do some mock grading. As I mentioned before, the evaluation of students is impartial. We don't have bias relative to knowing the student, because the evaluation is done by a panel of adults who are disinterested, in the sense that they don't have a stake in how well the student does. And at these events, it's also a celebratory event for students to be able to relax and enjoy giving their presentation, as well as watching those or others. I forgot to mention that today's PowerPoint will be put into the handouts folder so that you have access to it after today's session. And you can see right here on the slide that Maria's presentation on the Mid-State World Language Day is linked, and you can click on it and watch it at your leisure. So we're now up to our point where we're going to put you in breakout rooms, and we're going to ask you to work together. Jordan and I have prepared a series of what we are calling vignettes. These vignettes are sample conversations between panelists that are discussing a student's performance, as well as what they did in the interview. And so these are fictional, but they are based on what we have heard in the past. Now you have a choice of 5. We're asking you to choose 2 of those 5 in your group. You're going to read the vignette, and then we're going to ask you to do 2 things with it. You're going to identify any promising practices you observe. What are some things that you are seeing in the vignette that you think should be replicated across all schools? We're also going to ask you to identify some next steps. Are there things that you did not observe that you think should be done, or things that you observe that you think should not be done, and put those in next steps? So we do want to point out that the next step to this process, and before we get to the vignettes, so as we take a look at the document you created, we really appreciate you doing this. This helps us, hopefully as much as it helped you. Again, some of the promising practices you thought included confirmation that the rubric was viewed and understood, asking if there were red flags, making sure to be inclusive of all panelists. Some next steps that you recommended: using rubric-specific language, citing specific evidence, responding verbally, providing concrete evidence. Right, very good. So what we're hoping that you did, because we're not going to go through all the vignettes, you have the answer key, is that this might be an activity that you could use to do some initial training with your prospective panelists. Now, just to be clear, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Let me boot this up here. Let's take a few minutes to talk about how the viewing of the vignettes and the discussion will work, whether you're attending with us live or watching this video recording after the event. Within the handouts folder, which you see linked here on this particular slide, there are 4 documents and a folder. The documents are listed in order for your convenience, and that is the order in which you should access them. Document number 1 is a list of 5 vignettes. These are sample conversations between panelists that we would like you to analyze and determine what promising practices you're seeing in those discussions and what next steps might there be. What are things that the panelists are doing that perhaps they shouldn't do, or what is not being done that should be done? After you've looked at the vignettes, and you're going to choose at least 2 of them to do, but you can certainly do all 5, you're going to look at the breakout sessions notes sheet, which is the second document on this slide. Now, during the live webinar, we had breakout rooms actually enter in their thoughts regarding promising practices and next steps right on this breakout sessions note document. If you're watching this recording and you want to see what others who participated in this webinar wrote down as their promising practices or next steps, we encourage you to click on this link for the breakout sessions notes and take a look at what they put and perhaps compare it to what you observed in those vignettes. Once you've done that, a third document is listed here on this slide called the answer key for vignettes. This is the answer key provided by the presenters. So again, you would compare what you observed against what is on the answer key. Finally, on this slide, we have a link to the 4th document that is the question note catcher for this webinar, and that's where all general questions are entered. So let's take a moment before we release you and show you what the actual folder online looks like. In front of you, you see the contents of the handouts folder for this webinar on training panelists. Again, there is a folder, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then there are a list of 5 documents plus an important links document. Now, the important links document is for the entire webinar, and it's just a useful document that shows you all of the links for the different documents that you have in the handouts folder. The number 1 document, again, is your vignettes. This is what you will open first, and you'll see that there are 5 vignettes, which are conversations between panelists. You can choose any of the 5 vignettes that you wish, or you can simply do all 5 of them. So again, your first task is to read at least 2 of the vignettes. Once you've read those and you've identified for yourself what you think the promising practices and the next steps are for each vignette, you can check and see what other groups who participated in the live webinar thought. You'll see in this document, the breakout room, you have links to the different vignettes. So you pick the one that you did. Let's say that we did vignette number 2. And if you click on the bookmark or you simply scroll down the document, you'll see this is the notes page where different groups who read vignette number 2 put their promising practices and next steps. So feel free to compare what you observed against what others who participated in the live webinar observed. Your third step is then to check what you identified as promising practices and next steps against the answer key. And this third document here that you see is labeled as such. You'll open it up and you'll see that for each vignette below, there are notes which identify any promising practices or any next steps. Please compare what you identified against this answer key. Now, if you have any questions that you want addressed by the webinar presenters, you can always enter them in the question catcher. And of course, for your convenience, we have added a 5th document, which is the PDF of the entire PowerPoint presentation for your own records. Now, I'd like to take a moment and tell you about what we consider to be another really important activity as you train panelists. This activity was covered in February's webinar on using the Seal of Biliteracy rubric, but we're including it here because as a trainer of panelists, this is an important next step once you've gone through the vignettes. In the folder marked Sample Student Video Transcript and Evaluation, you will find a series of 3 items. The first item, number 1, is the actual edited video from a student who was giving a presentation in English on his culminating project. In the video, you'll also hear an interview of the student by the panelists. We encourage you to not only watch this edited video, but to have your panelists train by also watching this video together in a group. The student is an English language learner, and so to ensure the utmost comprehension, we also created a transcription of everything the student said, as well as what the panelists said. This is document number 2. You'll open it up and you'll see it looks just like a movie script with the person who is speaking, followed by whatever that they said. So you can cross-reference this if there are any portions of the video that your team cannot understand. Now, once you have watched the video with a blank rubric in hand, and you have taken notes on the student's proficiency that reflect the language of the rubric, you can then gather your panelists and take a look at the official completed rubric. This is the 3rd document in this folder. You'll see it looks exactly like the rubric for culminating projects. It contains some general comments from our evaluation committee about the student's performance. And then it uses the following color coding. The language of the rubric is highlighted in blue, where we found a preponderance of evidence from the student's performance that justifies the rating that we selected. But we wanted to double check that the student wasn't perhaps at the next highest level of proficiency. So we went to the next highest level and we looked at all the performance indicators. And if we found evidence for those performance indicators, we highlighted it in blue. If we did not find evidence, we highlighted it in yellow. And this allowed us to confirm that our rating was correct. Let's take a look at the first standard that we have in the rubric. We're going to use standard 3 because the student's presentation takes place first. Notice that we not only highlighted again in blue where we thought the student was in terms of performance, we also looked at the next highest level and we did not find evidence for this level, so we highlighted those items in yellow. And then below, we specifically identified evidence observed during the student's presentation for the advanced mid proficiency level. And you'll see, following what we described in the webinar, we separated these out into the facts: the function, the accuracy, the context, and the text type. Again, you don't have to be this thorough, but for the purposes of this process, we then took notes on arguments against a different proficiency level, just to double check that the one that we had selected was correct. So you can see we went to the next highest level of performance, which for this student would be advanced high. And we gave our arguments, highlighted in yellow, why we thought that the student's performance did not demonstrate that next highest level. This process repeats itself for the next part of the culminating project. You'll see on the page shown, we now have the panel interview. And so we have standard number 2, interpersonal communication. We have highlighted in blue where we think the student performed. We looked at the next highest level and we highlighted in yellow where we did not think there was evidence. We then took very copious notes, quoting from the student performance where we saw evidence for the proficiency level we selected for interpersonal communication, and we addressed all of the facts. We then did a double check, went to the next highest level of performance, reviewed the performance descriptor, and put arguments down in yellow why we did not feel that the student met that level of proficiency, thus confirming our original designation of proficiency for the student. Now you'll notice on this document that we do not address standard 1, which is interpretive. And that is because interpretive communication is generally evaluated by the classroom teacher or the project advisor prior to the student's presentation. In further honing the skills of your panelists is to watch the video. And I'm going to show you where that is right in the folder. Let me just get out of here. I'm going to go back to the handouts folder. You'll see in there, there's something called sample student video transcript and evaluation. So there's 3 items in this folder. The first is the actual video that you can watch. It's about 9 minutes. It is an edited down video just so it is doable in a short amount of time. You then have the transcript of the student's English presentation as well as the interview. So if you were unclear on something that was said, then you can read it on the transcript. The last thing that you're going to see in this folder, I think, is the most useful document for training. It is the actual culminating project scoring sheet. And what you're going to see are some general comments that we made about the student's performance. And then you're going to see the different sections of the rubric in which we highlighted in blue where we found a preponderance of the evidence. And then underneath, you will see the evidence we gathered that justifies this rating. In yellow, you have items where we tried to look for consistent evidence and we did not find it. And that was a double check that our initial estimation of the student's proficiency was correct. So the recommendation would be to train your panelists initially by using the points that we have outlined in this presentation. Make them familiar with the rubric, talk about the FACT, the function, accuracy, context, and text type, and then have them go through those 5 vignettes, asking them to pull out promising practices as well as practices to avoid or next steps that they'd recommend. Once they start to feel more comfortable with the rubric through those vignettes, I would have them sit down and watch the video with a blank rubric and take notes on the student's performance, and then discuss as a group what evidence you saw and build that consensus. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. We are going to wrap up here and allow for some questions. By the way, the video was provided by the Buffalo Public School System, which we very much appreciate. We want to let you know that we do have a SEAL guidance toolkit. It will be revised this summer because it's been a few years since we revised it. But we want to point out module number 5, which is preparing for panel presentations, which can also be helpful in training your panelists. We do have one final webinar after today. It will be on April 10th. It is co-presented by myself and Anna Stukes from the Midwest Arbor, and the title is Demystifying the End-of-Year Data Submission for the SEAL. But we also want to point out that the 7 webinars that you see linked here on the right side of the screen, from starting a SEAL program all the way through to February's using the rubric to evaluate presentations, these have all been recorded. The recordings are available on the website. And for the first 6, we have the post assessments already prepared. Remember, the benefit of the post assessment is that you can watch the video at any time, day or night. And if you get at least a 7 out of 10 on one of the post assessments, you get an automatic certificate sent to you, which can either be a certificate of attendance or CTLE if you choose that. We have 8 post assessments for several reasons for each of our webinars. One is because the first time through, you may not have grasped what you needed to, and so you need another shot, and we want to provide that multiple opportunity for you. But you also may want to refresh your skills next year, and so we provide that so you can keep going back to this. We're wrapping up here, and Diane will get to your question in just a second. If you're not already aware, we have something called the SEAL Forum. This is a monthly meeting where we offer guidance and support on the Seal of Biliteracy. We have about 360 SEAL coordinators who belong to this. About 120 will come to any one meeting. And you'll be able to ask questions. We'll cover topics that are germane to the Seal of Biliteracy, but you also get first notice of upcoming opportunities before it's released to the public. Great way to network. You can come to the meetings that work for you. The ones that don't work for you, you can always watch the videos later and consult the documents on our Google Drive. And you get CTLE credit for any meetings you do attend. The join link is included here. You can also find it on our website. Again, we're going to put the PDF of the PowerPoint right into that handouts folder immediately following this webinar. Now, you can always ask us. We're happy to respond with any questions you have regarding the SEAL, but we want to let you know that we have these wonderful organizations called the ARBERNs, our Regional Bilingual Education Resource Networks, and there are 8 of them across the state. My co-presenter, Dr. Gonzalez, is from the Long Island ARBERN. These are all linked here. You can tell which ARBERN is your ARBERN by locating yourself on this color-coded map. They have lots of resources for you, and each one of them has a designated resource specialist to help you with the Seal of Biliteracy. So if you are in the Long Island region, you would reach out to Jordan. If you're in another region, you can see the smiling face of the resource specialist that will be available to you should you need assistance with the SEAL. So I believe we were able to tackle all of our lofty goals for today, including being able to find those rubrics, knowing how to describe what the presentations and interviews are like to the panelists you're training, help them understand the facts, as well as some best strategies and resources that they can access to have themselves trained.